Thank you, Erica, and thank you for the comment. As a speaker, I know how it feels to start to get drowned out by the background. Well, to say the least. Anyway, thank you all for having me. It's awesome to be back in Korea again for Korea Blockchain Week. I haven't been here since 2019, which was one of the formative trips out of the U.S. and seeing the international space in the crypto world. So today, I'm going to talk a little bit about Web3, the next era of growth tools. What this actually means and what I'm going to cover is really where I think we're going over the next 2 years. And given that, how I think we can maybe focus on some specific areas to speed up that adoption and ultimately better position this industry. For those that were here earlier or watched the live stream, Mike Brock from Polygon actually gave a fantastic presentation earlier today, kind of covering a macro view of this overall, how is the evolutionary cycle going? And he brought up some good points that I'll reference through this. For those watching the live stream, definitely recommend watching his talk. Him and I see eye to eye, and I would say he's giving the big picture. I'm zooming in on, I think, the next couple of years before whenever the next cycle kicks off. So just a little bit about me, from New York City originally, based in Hong Kong now, although pretty much nomadic at the moment. My background in the space is I was a early core team member of Blockstack, or Stacks. Joined in 2017, helped them scale their developer communities. More recently, I started my own company on top of the network in 2020. We do a bunch of funding, partnerships, things like that. And then I have a new startup with a number of co-founders, all from Hong Kong, all folks that have been in the space for probably 3-4+ years. And what we're doing is we're creating the kind of Web3 growth and marketing tool suite, not just for crypto native projects, but also for those who are starting to play with crypto assets on more traditional platforms. So I'll go into a little bit more detail on both of those at the end, but for now, let's kind of kick it off. So I just want to have this slide to level set for the talk. This is, for the purposes of this talk, how I kind of think of the building blocks of Web3, both in terms of concepts and capabilities. There's a million different ways I think you can present this and highlight this, so this is definitely not canonical, but I really think this concept and what we're driving towards with this technology starts at this basic concept of open, permissionless digital ownership. Anything we're doing in this space starts with that. On top of that, once you actually have the ability for an individual to prove and actually have in a concrete way digital permissionless ownership, you can now start to enable them to do things with that ownership, buy it, sell it, buy other ownership, put a price on it, and you start to create digital end-to-end economies which are made up of these incentive structures. The digital end-to-end economies are a big second part of the innovation here, because for the first time we have global 24/7 markets for this digital ownership. And the incentive structures in each of these markets is kind of how that behavior is directed. Lastly, and kind of finally, you have the atomic units of this ownership, or the incentives, which is really how I think of fungible tokens and NFTs. They're tools. But so if this is kind of the Web3 stack, and if these are the concepts and really what this enables, you know, I think one of the themes we've seen is that we all feel like we should be a little further by this point. There seems to be a general sentiment there. You know, there's still a lot of the UX is terrible in the space. There's still a ton of friction. You know, Mike Brock brought up great points that we're still, you know, pushing out descriptions of this space and marketing of this space to the masses in ways where we're describing the technology. We're not explaining the value to them. And I think it's all really valid, but, you know, if we do have this capability, why have we not gotten there yet? I think there's a lot of reasons. I think one reason, though, and one issue I've seen over the last few years, and I get why this problem has existed, is, you know, for the most part, everyone has been focused on launching tokens for the last 5-6 years, you know, whatever the exact time frame is. And I get why. You know, the ability to do permissionless global fundraising at the click of a button, and, you know, raise a hell of a lot of money in some cases, is a huge innovation. Now, as with many huge innovations, I think, it was used in very inappropriate ways at different times throughout this, but that's part of the natural maturation cycle of a technology. That being said, I do think we need to increasingly get the focus off launching tokens. And kind of why is that? Well, there's a lot of text here, but the kind of overarching point that Benedict Evans is making, and for those unfamiliar, he's kind of a tech commentator and a VC going way back, and he hasn't really gotten Web3 historically, but to his credit, he's kept kind of working through it, and he's actually starting to get it, and I actually think some of what he brings in terms of his skepticism is well worth it for this space, because it's really asking the question, what is this for? What are these innovations best at? What are these tools for? And I think one of the problems with the focus being just on launching tokens, or predominantly over the past few years, is the fact that in a ton of cases, and increasingly as we create more and more different types of applications with these tools, the tokens and the incentive models on the Web3 part is really just the monetization method, the bootstrapping method, or the distribution method. It's not the product. Now, in a case of something like MakerDAO, that's fundamentally financial, yes, that incentive structure, that token structure is the product. That's why that works and has, some sticky amount of user base. But something else, something like, let's say, STEPN, and I actually am not going to hate on STEPN at all. I'll come back to that in a second. But that I think was a great example of a pretty novel and interesting incentive and monetization mechanism, but without a fundamental product underneath it. And in addition to these things in many cases not being the product, one of the other consequences with that is it brings up a really interesting question of, so when do we launch it? How do we launch it? And there's a lot more experimentation to do there. Again, I'm not really trying to hate on anything that's happened. It's not really how I see it. I kind of look at it as, in some cases you wish certain things didn't happen, but this is the typical adoption curve of any sufficiently innovative technology that has ever existed in human history. I know there's a lot of people, especially right now, that are looking at the crypto space and kind of saying specifically, why are these guys so bad? And yeah, there's a lot of unfortunate examples in our space. You go back to any time with sufficient innovation like this, and you're going to see the same thing. I think we're somewhere, especially at the phase between early adopter, early majority, whatever that means. I'm not going to put a year on it, because I think at these conferences I've heard that we're in 1995 or 1996 6 or 7 times. But if that is the case, if this is very innovative tools, and they do have some very interesting uses, but maybe we need to focus on some different ways of using them around some different types of products. How can we just generally speed the adoption up from where we are today to where we're going? Well, I think to start, we need to begin to really focus on what the real innovations and value adds are here, and start looking at these things in many ways as tools, and being a little more honest with ourselves about what they're good at and what they're not. Just to define the real innovation, what I really see as the real innovation here is the fact that, if the internet enabled anyone to publish a bit of information and distribute it globally instantly at the click of a button, then what Web3 enables is it enables an individual to prove ownership over that bit of information, and then a market to be created to put a price on it and globally trade it 24/7. That's huge. But so given that, one thing that I think is interesting is for looser ecosystems, communities that may already exist online, or certainly some of the newer Web3 ones, one interesting fact of this is it kind of changes the way you have to think about the monetization structure of that community. It's much less like company revenue. And it's much more analogous to something like an open economy GDP. Because again, for the first time, we're able to create fully end-to-end digital economies that do not have to be tethered to the fiat world at all, potentially. More importantly as well, given that, one of the things I think this technology is great for as tools is bootstrapping the supply side of a market. A few people have talked about this in the space, but my favorite example of this is a cell tower network. When there's certainly demand for, let's say, a brilliant new cell tower network that is better than anything that exists. But what is the incentive for someone to go and build one tower? That has no value to the demand side. 2 towers has no value to the demand side. The only way to satisfy the demand side is basically to get thousands of towers up, because then you actually have a network that's usable and satisfies that demand. But how do you incentivize that critical mass to be built in order to meet that demand? Well, the way we've done it in the past is basically governments give companies a bunch of money and contracts and mandate they do it. We now have open incentive structures that allow us to incentivize people to fill the supply side of a market when there is not yet demand. It also allows, and I think we're seeing a ton of this right now, and I think this is one of my favorite parts of the space, the ability to monetize digital commons and also the ability to monetize community access, activity, and culture. Those are kind of 2 sides of the same coin. Examples there are, to me, one of the most interesting things about Bitcoin, and forgive me, I know this is ETH Seoul, but for a moment, I don't think of it as digital gold or as a store of value. Rather, what it is it's the first global commons we've had that, rather than falling into the tragedy of the commons, actually uses the things that create the tragedy of the commons within the system to create the desired outcome. And then obviously monetizing community access, activity, and culture. We're seeing a ton of this happen with NFTs at the moment, both in Web3 and more in Web 2.5. Just quickly, I won't spend too much time on this, but just unpacking kind of the main pieces here. Fungible tokens, in this kind of vein, I really think of as the blood cells of the digital economy, atomic units of incentivization. NFTs are much more the atomic unit of digital ownership. And NFTs, I really think if you zoom out and you think about how flexible and all-encompassing analog NFTs are to the real world, house keys, credit cards, I mean, the list goes on. Pretty much almost everything we use is an analog form of an NFT. The fact that we can now create that digitally is, yeah, it's going to revolutionize everything. But in a lot of ways, I think not necessarily in the way that we are thinking about it now is, just these digital collectibles. And then lastly, tying this all together is tokenomics, which this, I think, is a very latent science. In my opinion, 0 tokenomics experts exist in the world. It's too new a field. There are people who have done some amazing experimentation and learning who are certainly the furthest toward the expert side of the spectrum and are climbing that learning curve the fastest. But this is an incredibly disciplinary area of expertise where, again, with the focus on launching tokens, we just haven't experimented with it enough at all. When do tokenomic structures make sense to implement around a product? What types of tokenomic structures? Can you have a tokenomic structure that stays the same for the whole lifetime of a product, or does that need to evolve as the product evolves? It's a complete blue ocean of experimentation that we still have to do. I find that really exciting, personally. And to circle back a little bit, we're starting to see this happen in some very nascent ways. I think we're all familiar with this. The amount of, despite the market crashing, despite a lot of unfortunate events in the past 6 months happening in the space, this is only accelerating. And this is, in my opinion, the much more important thing to put your eye on than the market price is, where is this technology actually spreading to? How are people actually starting to use it? And this is where I think the mass adoption comes from over the next 2 years once we hit the next cycle. We spent the last 2 years getting a little too far over our skis in terms of the innovation that we've created and what we've been pushing. In that, we've created more and more different types of assets, layers for these assets to interact with each other. We've gone really deep down this crypto native rabbit hole, and I think that's great. All of those ideas are going to be extremely valuable, and I think the nexus of innovation in this space will always be the kind of core crypto community that really is playing on the fringes with what you can do with this stuff. But what I think happens over the next 2 years, and by the time we get to the next market condition being right for a run, whenever that is, one of the reasons that will happen is that everyone, almost everyone, whether they know it or not, will have an NFT or will have access to tokens, because all of these traditional platforms are already adopting these as just usable on their networks, whether it's Reddit, adopting NFTs for a number of uses, Twitter, Nike, I mean, the list goes on. There's probably a longer list of people doing this that happens every week than what's on this slide. And once that critical mass builds up more and more, well, now you have a whole different type of user base to start innovating on top of once the next kind of cycle hits the upswing. And so I think that's kind of where I think the next 2 years are. A lot of time is spent with these assets infiltrating traditional platforms. I think if you're any sort of digital platform, or in many cases real world platform, that already has a thriving community, but there's a lot of community activity that's adjacent to your brand that you don't get to capture and monetize. Community culture kind of being an interesting example in some cases, then these are very interesting tools, and you're seeing people kind of go down that rabbit hole. And so I think once we get there, then I think we can start on the evolution of some of these Web2 networks become more decentralized protocols. Maybe let's see what happens with Twitter. But I think there needs to be a seeding of a critical mass of people with these assets through traditional platforms before that happens, and I think we're seeing that happen today. These are just some other points of, I think, where we kind of go once we have more and more of that critical seeding, but we'll see. And then briefly, kind of how I'm involved. So again, I still kind of work a lot on the Stacks project, run my own company there. For those that don't know Stacks, Web3, where it settles down to Bitcoin, we will have EVM compatibility by the end of the year, I believe, which will be very exciting for kind of a number of reasons. Essentially, smart contracts on Stacks allow you to natively control Bitcoin taproot addresses. So you can do things like mint, buy, sell, NFTs, all with Bitcoin, things like that. And then Conductive, again, the user insights and acquisition platform for Web3. We have an engine that pulls in all Web2 and Web3 data we call the Conductive layer. And using that, we can enable a company to get an end-to-end understanding of their community, their users, and whether their strategies for making those users stickier and acquiring more users is actually working or not. Because from experience, I will say we've been flying pretty blind in terms of data in this space, a la the way Web 2 has, at least. But yeah. Hope you all enjoyed that. And if you would like to talk to me any more about any of these ideas, because there's a lot of ideas here, and each of them, I think, is quite a big rabbit hole to go down. You can either shoot me an email or follow me on Twitter. My DMs are open. And yeah. Thanks, everyone, for listening, and hope you enjoy your rest of your time in Seoul.